everybody, I am Jessica Henry Gray and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm really excited to have you with me today. Today I'm going to demonstrate painting children. I have this amazing photograph of this adorable little girl with stunning curls. So I'm going to show you today how I go about capturing that childlike face and that beautiful skin tones, and of course I'll demonstrate some of her curly hair. So let's jump in and get going. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to like and subscribe, and I always appreciate your comments. All right, so let's get going.
All right, so I am beginning with a tone on my canvas. It is burnt sienna and a little bit of yellow ochre. And I'm just brushing it on with a large brush with a little bit of thinner. And I am going to wipe a little bit of it off and just to soften the surface a little bit. Now I'm taking a smaller brush with a little bit darker mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue and a very little bit of thinner in it. And very loosely I'm blocking in the parameters of where the little girl is going to sit on the canvas. It's important at this stage to keep my brush loose and just keep it general. I'm just blocking in sort of the parameters. How much air and space does she need around her head? And so that is my first thing that I'm thinking about in the whole context of composition. So when I get her sort of blocked in the right size that I want her to be on the canvas, I can begin then to define some of just the basic shape a little bit more. Once I get the basic shape in of the head, the hair, the mass, I work from the inside out. So I want to establish where the eye line is on the head. And that was that first indication I made horizontally going across her. And I always do it curved because unless the head is straight on, it's going to have a slight curve to it. So I did a slight curve, and also noting that since her head is tipped upwards, we see less of the top of her cranium and more of her mandible jaw area. So that eye line is not going to be where we normally see it on the head divisions. So it's up there, and now I'm building the face away from the eyes. So I indicated the eyes and their location, and then I went down to the nose. So just observing the distance that the nose is from the eyes is how I indicated the structure of her head in that passage. Now I'm also going through and just putting in some darker indications of some of the values around there. It helps me to sort of identify where I'm going to go with her overall head shape in the context of the drawing and so forth. So these are the darker values as I'm starting to sculpt out her contours. I feel it's pretty much in place with where I'm going to go for the overall structure, and everything's sort of blocked in as far as the face and the hair. I'm coming back through now and satisfied with the marks that I indicated for where the eyes are going to be placed. I can come back through and just tighten up the form of her eyes and her expression and the fact that she's looking upwards. So I'm trying to capture that element right away in the painting. I'm starting to block in the eye socket around the eyes. It's kind of harder to see, especially on children as they're more fleshy, but around the eyes there's a definite socket shape, and that's what gives you the likeness. So I'm working on some of those shapes more on the shadowed side of her face, as well as just some other places under her nose, and it helps to work. You'll see I jump around quite a bit. But in doing that, I'm able to see it as a universal whole. Just by focusing on just one thing at a time, you tend to get it askew because you can just focus on one eye and try to get it perfect, then focus on the other eye and try to get it perfect, and then you focus on the nose and you try to get it perfect. What happens is you're not seeing the whole face as a universal whole, and it can completely fall apart like a house of cards. So by working together, as I jump around and I block in the hair mass a little bit more, or I take my tissue there, get it wet, and kind of sculpt out some of the lighter values, that helps me to see some of the light, medium, and dark values at the same time. Now I put a little bit of alizarin crimson in the lower portions of her cheek and in some other places where I saw more of a reddish tint. And that helps me also to, especially in painting children, to early on capture that rosy glow in their cheeks. Some of that will come through the thinner layers of paint as I go forth in this painting. But you can see, I'll take my brush and I'll dip it in the thinner and rub it on, and then I'll take a little bit of the paper towel, roll it into a point, and just rub it, and it lifts out the paint. And there's a little bit of finesse in learning how to do this. It doesn't take a long time to figure out to what extent you rub, to what degree you put the thinner on. A little bit of practice and you get the hang of it. And some people like portraits just finished to this extent. So for the sake of this demo, I want to show you a little bit more on mixing color and skin tones, so I do jump into that more. But it's a really pretty and interesting way to work painting, just by studying the values. So I'm working on identifying the shape of her jaw, and even though her face is tipped up, her whole face is a little bit more scrunched together than an adult. As adults, our features spread out a little bit more and elongate, but as she's tipped her chin up, just her eyes, nose, and mouth, I want to make sure that those are in the proper context of a child's face. And in doing that, you can do that by working on the jawline and how poofy her cheeks are. Watch that distance from where the edge of her jaw is in relation to her eyes. All right, so I'm blocking in her hair as I'm going along here. And one thing I want to call your attention to in the course of painting anybody or anything, always try to pull out the straight lines. Don't be looking for curves, but look for the strong angles, even in children and women, whatever. Look for the angles in the form, and that will give you a more of a solid sense of structure. So that's what I wanted to point that out as I was going through this. Now, another unfortunate aspect of filming is that the camera is always at an angle, and so you don't see the exact proportion. In the editing of this, I noticed that her face looks a little bit more narrow in the painting than what it is in reality. And again, that is part of the camera being to the side. I wanted the edges of her hair where it met the background to be very soft and diffused. I knew that it was going to create a sense of it being like a glowing halo, and I just love that image. Also, it just had this wonderful sense of being fuzzy and curly, and so just by really softening and diffusing the edge made a lot of sense to me. It's her curls, the ringlets themselves are very crisp and sharp, and so those are fine to be more articulate, just where I needed them, but the rest could be diffused. All right, now I'm working on her mouth, and I'm just indicating the darker values where I see the edges of her mouth tucked into her cheeks. And I don't really demonstrate very much of the actual measuring that I'm doing, but in this case, I'm looking at it with my eyes on the photograph, drawing a line straight up from the edge of her mouth and seeing where it hits her eye. So then on my painting, I'll come over to the eye and drop the line down, and that will indicate where I need to put the edge of the mouth. So it kind of works in reverse. You measure on the photo, and then you come to your painting and you measure backwards from the way that you measured on your photo. So I'm just coming through and pulling in a little bit more of the information around the eyes and just making some of that look a little bit more articulate. I will come back to the mouth, of course, and work on getting the shape of it more, but I just wanted to, first of all, put it in place on her head. Painting is more like sculpting. And if you can think about your canvas as being like a lump of clay in front of you, you have to start somewhere. You have to start gouging out the deeper portions of a portrait. And so I always start with the darkest values first. I mean, I loosely draw it in shape, but as I start working on the actual painting, I always go from your dark shadows and you sculpt out the contour, then eventually you build towards the light. In my initial stages of this painting, I do that, and then I start wiping in some of the lighter values so that I can see where I'm going with those. But that is not the lightest that those light values will end up being. I will pull in a little bit more intense bright light where those highlights are hitting her face. All right, a little bit of yellow ochre, little rose madder, or alizarin crimson, and some white. It gives me a nice neutral Caucasian skin tone where the light's hitting her forehead up there and throughout her face. I use that sort of as a base. I'll start with the foundation of yellow ochre and white, and into that I can mix varying degrees of either alizarin crimson or cadmium red light. The alizarin is cooler, cad red light is warmer. So in her face, I'm working on, the overall photograph is in general pretty cool. I think she was standing in shade, but you can't just paint it painting all cool or all warm. So I had to make a choice, and I decided to leave her shadows very cool, very toward the pinkish purple spectrum, and then her highlights were warmer. So in the parts of her face where there's a little bit of highlight hitting it, instead of using more of the alizarin crimson, I used a little bit more of the cadmium red light and some cadmium yellow light into the white. And that made it just have that sense of being a little bit more warm where the light's hitting it. So a little bit of indication of her eyebrows. Children's eyebrows are very pale. And so if you paint children's eyebrows too dark, they won't have the appearance of looking childlike. So there's a number of things you can do to your painting to make sure you capture a child's appearance. Their lips are brighter, their eyebrows are pale, their eyelashes are very long, and their cheeks are full and rosy. And then their smile lines, especially on children where they're smiling, we tend to paint them dark because as we sit and observe them, they appear dark. But if you take the whole face in as a whole, if you paint them very dark, they're going to age them. So make sure that those smile lines are very light. All right, so and their noses are tiny. I'm working on her neck now, and I'm using yellow ochre, white, into my bluish gray mixture. That is that is burnt sienna and ultramarine blue that forms my bluish gray mixture. And so a little bit of yellow ochre and white into that to get those neck shadows. I want the neck to feel more a part of the background. If her ears were showing, it would be the same rule for that as well. Necks and ears are part of the background. The face is foreground. So when I'm painting the neck and ears, I'm incorporating more background colors into it. Since my background is going to be whitish, I'm including her hair as part of that as well. So taking colors that would be in her hair, I'm incorporating those into her neck colors. Put a yellow ochre and white into that will just give me some subtle highlights for her neck just to show some form, but I have not incorporated a lot of red into it, alizarin crimson or otherwise, so that it didn't have that sense of coming forward like I want on her face. So the highlights on her neck are very subdued. All right, a little bit of alizarin crimson and white to get some of that rosy cheek parts of her face. On the lid side, I'm using a little bit more cadmium red into those rosy cheeks. And on the shadowed side, there's a little bit more alizarin crimson just to give that overall sense of this is in shadow and the other side is in light. Okay, so when I'm satisfied with the overall block-in of the face, I feel that the planes are indicated by the colors and values. I'm coming back through now and I'm refining the drawing of the various features. So I'm starting with her eyes. As soon as the eyes get in place, the whole portrait starts to feel a little bit more finished. So the actual shape of the irises themselves is my focus right now. Getting where the tear duct is in relation to the iris, what is the shape of the white itself, and of course that white is never just white out of the tube. It is more closely related to her skin color, and so there's a little bit of blue and white in that. So there's just use your skin color, add a teeny bit more blue and white, and it'll have the appearance of being the glassy white of the eye. I still painted a little darker anyway, and then I add just a touch of white at the end. So I'm sculpting out. I make the iris of the eye a little bit bigger than I need so that I can sculpt out the exact shape of the white of the eye, and then I work the skin down around the shape of the iris as well. And I can also work on more of the actual what's going on in the iris while I'm working on the color and the highlights inside the eye. Okay, so I'm working on her eyelashes too, and I'm softening what is going to be under the passage where her eyelashes will sit. So I'm trying to get the value and the highlight just right as the flesh of her eyelid area comes up to her eyebrows, and then I will put the eyelashes in. Children's eyes appear larger because they are the exact same size as ours are, but their faces are smaller, so they seem larger. Every human being's eye is 25 millimeters across. That is just a standard. It is the same size as the American quarter. It's just an easy way to remember. So when painting children, you don't want to paint their eyes looking abnormally large because they are the same size as ours, but they are appearing large because they are in a smaller face. So I'm just working on the skin around the tear ducts and some of the other smaller pieces of information. And I'm using a tiny brush, and I like this one in this passage of the painting because I can use it to sort of help refine the sculpting of the skin around the eyes. So I'll wipe my brush completely clean, and instead of blending, I soften with what you see as tiny little lines just within the confines of one particular color or value mass. So I'll soften where that color meets another color, and I'll wipe my brush off as I move to another color or value. And then if you could see the painting up close, you'd see a million teeny little scratches. And I come through at the end with an extremely soft brush, you'll see, and I just sort of soften those little tiny scratches. But that is how I would blend for especially a child's portrait. I don't do that for adults or older men who have textured faces with beards and so forth. But on a children's face, I just think it seems more appropriate to have it softer, more blended, but I want to keep it feeling fresh. So I don't try to labor over children's portraits. They tend to look labored over and I don't want them to be picked at. So keep it fresh and light. So if you're going to blend, this is what my technique, and this is what works for me, is I just take a tiny brush and soften within the masses of color or values. Okay, so working on her pretty little mouth, I'm just taking a little bit of alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, and white. And it's the same, this is actually the same palette that I use for plein air painting with the addition of cadmium red light. So I'm very versatile, very comfortable in these colors. And when I say the same three colors over and over again, it's with varying degrees of this or that. So in her mouth, I have a little bit more alizarin crimson and then less of the yellow ochre and white. And so that's just what I'm working on. Make sure that whenever you're painting a mouth, that all of your edges are soft, or it will look makeup-y and illustrated sort of line drawn on the face. And so I definitely try to be cognizant of making the edges soft where they need to be. There are a few places on the contours of lips and mouths that you can have a sharp little accent. And those places are like right in the corner where the cheek and the mouth meet, right where the mouth opens and tucks into the cheek. I like a little sharp accent there. It makes the person appear pleasant or smiling. I'm careful not to make the line in the middle of the two lips too dark, because it can create the appearance of having their lips tightly pressed together. Her lips are just apart a little, and there's a little bit of an indication of teeth in there. And teeth, again, are just like the eye. It's basically the skin color with just a little bit of grayer indication. You do not want to paint them refrigerator white because it just looks artificial. So just a subtle hint there. Her lower lip, the top part of her lower lip is going to be a little bit sharper line than the bottom as it curves and goes down into the skin. And the reason I say that is because there's a darker line indicating where the teeth are behind her lower lip. So there's a little bit sharper edge there. All right, now I'm starting to hit the highlights with a little bit more intensity. So I'm going through and I'm pulling out a few more of the places where I saw a little bit brighter light and softening some of the dark shadows where I saw them, and just pulling out those indications. I'm also making sure that when I do put in these highlights that I keep everything soft, especially as I'm working around her mouth and her chin. These are very soft highlights. And the strongest highlights hitting her face are centered around her cheek and her nose and her upper lip. So those are going to be receiving the most intense bright lights. All right, her face is at a place where I feel that it's important that I start building up the actual texture and definition of her hair. So I'm working on just developing some of the lighter curls and the lighter masses. So there's a little bit of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre, and white to work on those lighter curls. Within those lighter masses, I'll tuck in some darker accents where the curls are creating a shadow. All right, a little bit of Alizarin Crimson and Cadmium Red Light mixed together, and I'm going to work on some of her clothes. I'm not going to get into a lot of definition, and I don't want that whole lower passage of the canvas to be covered in red, but I did want to sort of suggest that she's wearing this red shirt. I think it just adds a nice color pop to the whole painting. So I kept it the color that I saw. And then a little bit on her shoulder, the little cadmium yellow and a little white into the red mixture. Just created the sense that that's her shoulder and the light's hitting it. Kept it loose and just that's it. Not a whole lot of detail or information. Okay, now I'm also working on some of the background, just putting some paint on the canvas to help define more the contours of her hair and as it blends into the background. And I'm using mostly white with a little bit of yellow ochre and in some places a little bit more blue. But at this point I'm beginning that marriage of hair to background. And some of those curls I wanted to pop a little bit more. And so that's what I'm doing with my brush here, while I'm also working on the paint for the background. Okay, so I'm taking a clean, dry brush and very lightly I'm just going through and softening some of these transitions that I felt were a little bit harsh on her face. So like the lights on her nose, the sharp edge where I see a shadow on her face that I don't want to be a sharp edge. I'm just looking for continuity and movement and round softness. And so that's what I'm doing with this brush. Okay, so taking back to my tiny little brush and cleaning up just the passage where her nostrils are, and as the skin from her nostrils tucks around, and I'm going through. No, earlier I talked about using that technique of blending with this tiny brush. So I can do a couple of things with it at the same time. I'm adding a little bit more articulate information and detail around the eyes, and then I'm also wiping it off carefully and then softening some of the transitions that and pulling in a few highlights where I need them. But again, just overall using it almost as a sculpting tool. A sculptor would use a smaller wire hoop to refine the shapes that he has. That's what I'm doing with this brush. And you can see how I'm trying really hard to keep the eyelashes very soft. You want them to feel very feathery. And so I'm just wiping my brush off with a little bit of indication of darker value. I'll soften like a little feather up for the eyelash. But I do not want them to look like individual hairs or they will look cartoony. And I certainly don't want that. So taking some of that darker value and I'm cleaning up the iris shape, putting in a few little highlights. And getting closer to being done with this. Coming through and just making sure that nothing got mushy. You can blend things too much and it'll start to lose some of that form that you worked so hard to get. So every passage where I'm working on blending, I just work on that value and then, or color, and then I wipe my brush off, and then I work on another value or color and I wipe my brush off. So that's all I'm doing with this for the purpose of blending. And her iris had two shines on them. The one was the intense little bright dot, and the other was sort of a gray blue part of the sky reflected in it. And I really kind of liked how glossy it made her eyes look. So I did the lighter gray square, and then I let it blend into the white of the eye, and it just had that overall glassy feeling. And then with the little bright sparkle, that's all it needed. So just cleaning up some of the passages around her mouth and nose and area. I'm just trying to finish that up as far as tightening it and polishing up the detail and information. All right, so wrapping up that passage, I'm now taking my very, very soft brush. I think it's just Squirrel. It's just a older brush. But I'm very, very light, almost just tickling the surface. I'm just softening some of those areas where I did the that blending with that teeny little brush. you can overdo it at this point. So be very, very delicate. Every now and then, just do a few brush strokes, do a little blending in one area, and then step back and look. You don't want to overdo it because you can really just lose your lines. So if you could see very closely, I'm hardly touching the surface. And that's what I'm doing in this, just to create that soft blended look. And I'll do that a little bit on the edge of her hair as well, just to really lose that edge of the contour of all that. A little bit on her neck. Before I can soften her hair completely into the background, I have to finish putting the background color on. A little bit more yellow ochre and white into that. And before I finish this entire painting, I shave in her hair just a little bit more. I didn't want it to be overwhelming. And then I come back through with that tiny brush and pull out a few more of the curls, the darker ones, and then I use a lighter paint, yellow ochre and white, to get some of the effects of the light hitting the outside of her hair. A few little highlights on her eyes, and it is done. Thank you everybody for joining me, and be sure to check out my links below. I've got some portrait workshops coming up, and I'm always happy to do portrait commissions, so take a look and join my newsletter. Thanks everybody.
Alright everybody, well that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it and find something in here that you can take away for your next painting session. Alright, so be sure to check out the links below, and I'm always available for questions. Shoot me an email if you're interested in portrait commissions or for some of my workshops coming up in 2021. Go ahead and join my newsletter and you will stay up to date on all of those announcements. Alright everybody, have a good week and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.